And for more, we're joined by François Heisbourg, chair of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. I've ceased to be chair for some time now, but I'm still with the Institute.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. Here we are on Saturday. It's going to be exactly 3 weeks since Hamas's attack. Yep. This sort of slow boil, can it continue?
It can, but it could also get very much worse very quickly if Iran and Hezbollah decide to enter the game full bore. That's not the case today. For the moment, it's shadow boxing more than the real thing. But that is sort of very basic question, which all of those in the strategic community are asking themselves. Will this conflict remain an Israeli-Hamas war, or will it become a much larger regional war with much more serious implications?
It's already a much bigger than regional implications because we're feeling it here domestically. Yep. We saw the French president modulate his speech on the trip he made to the Middle East earlier this week. As the casualty numbers rise, how long can it be tenable for Israel to wait before some kind of a major ground invasion?
The Israelis are having a domestic debate about how to balance the quest for the release of the 229 hostages, which is the latest number available, and the objective of uprooting Hamas's infrastructure in Gaza. And that is obviously in political terms, and indeed in military terms, not an easy arbitrage to make. But one way or the other, we'll know what the nature of the arbitrage is within, I would say, a few days.
You mentioned this fear of escalation, and we saw with the United States striking targets in 2 places in eastern Syria, clearly saying these are Iran-aligned militias that have been targeting the United States, both in Syria and Iraq. The rules of the game for now seem pretty clear.
The Americans stated that this had nothing to do with what is going on in Gaza and so on. And then you get to the last sentence, which is, I paraphrase, don't do stupid stuff. To the Iranians and their proxies. That is the most powerful signal which has been sent until now.
And when Iran issues threats like they did at the UN General Assembly on Thursday, how seriously do you take them?
I think they should be taken very seriously, but threats are threats. Acting on the basis of the threats is another story, and it is imperative. And this is one of the few things which are shared by, I think, practically every actor in the game except Hamas, and that is, it is how to avoid this thing getting completely out of control. You already mentioned the dire effects of the current Israeli-Hamas war on the way things play out in our own societies. But imagine if you have the whole of the Middle East going up in blazes, then economic affairs, price of energy, etc. Then you get into something which is a multiple of the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on the global economy.
Let's talk about that, because some people were scratching their heads when Joe Biden, in his speech from the Oval Office, tried to connect the dots between Hamas and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, though, we've seen a senior Hamas official visiting the Russian foreign ministry in the company of the Iranian deputy foreign minister. Is Russia back to the role it had as the benefactor of the Palestinians like it was in Soviet times?
I think you could put it that way, because the Soviet Union didn't do very much for the Palestinians, but they made a lot of noise about it. And I think we're back indeed to that sort of relationship. To my understanding, there has been very little traffic between Hamas and the Russians in military terms or in organizational terms. And I don't see that changing.
What will it do to relations between Russia and Israel?
Now that's an interesting question. Israel, for a variety of reasons, chose not to come out in full support of Ukraine when it was invaded by Russia. Now, Israel is faced with a very subtle form of payback, which is the Ukrainians coming to the full support of the Israelis and putting them in a very awkward situation, because the Russians are indeed now no longer considering Israel as a friendly country. I use the Russian vocabulary here. Israel is no longer a friendly country. Yeah, that is going to create some problems for those in Israel who are banking their prosperity or their political interests on the continuation of the relationship with Russia and the weight of the Russian diaspora in Israel.
All right, and stay with us, François Heisbourg, because we're going to go to Brussels. Our correspondent, Dave Keating, is there. Dave, you've been listening to us talk about, well, this sort of spillover effect in the two conflicts that Europe has to worry about, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and now the Middle East. An EU summit has just concluded where you are, the French president, for one, calling now for a humanitarian truce in Gaza. What's your other takeaways from that summit?
Well, I think what was clear is all of the leaders were trying to say the EU can do two things at once. It doesn't matter that there are now two major crises in the EU's neighborhood, war on the doorstep in two different directions. The EU can handle it. But the reality is it's going to be very tough, and that was manifested by the fact that Ukraine got bumped off the agenda yesterday. The EU leaders were arguing for 5 hours about one letter, the letter S, whether they were going to call for a humanitarian pause or humanitarian pauses. That took so long that they had to delay the conversation about Ukraine until today. And then the awkward elephant in the room was the fact that they had a new member. Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico was just elected last month on a campaign to end aid to Ukraine. He went ahead and did that yesterday morning. He ended all military aid from Slovakia to Ukraine. And so he was there in the room also saying that the EU shouldn't even give non-military aid to Ukraine because of corruption in the country. He didn't think EU money should be going to fund Ukrainian corruption. So clearly this is going to be very difficult. In Macron's press conference at the end of today, he was saying we remain fully committed in their conclusions. They say that they are in it for as long as it takes to support Ukraine. Is that really the case? I think we're going to see in the coming months.
You mentioned it was a late night, the negotiations over the Middle East. One man seems to have driven the conversation, Pedro Sanchez of Spain, able to get the EU leaders to agree on the need for an international conference.
Yeah, so there's basically two camps here on the Israel-Palestine question. On one end, you have Spain as the largest country representing the camp that's more sympathetic to the Palestinians, and you have Germany on the other end of the spectrum, the least sympathetic to Palestinians, the most supportive of Israel in an unqualified way. So they had to find some compromise between those two extremes. What they ended up with was pauses, plural. Pedro Sanchez didn't like that. He wanted a full ceasefire, but he would have been okay going into the summit with pause. He said he could only accept pauses and sign up to these conclusions if the EU also called for this peace conference, which has been his idea. He's been calling that for the last 2 weeks, really. And he says it could bring about a peace, a long, durable peace. Their chatter is that it could be in Madrid because Madrid hosted Israel-Palestine peace conference in 1991. But when it would be is anyone's guess. If you talk to the Spanish, they're saying soon, the next couple of months. Olaf Scholz, German chancellor, was asked about this during his press conference. He said, okay, it's a good idea for signaling. I think what he meant was calling for the conference was a good idea for signaling. But when it comes to actually doing it, well, it's very complicated and it'll take a lot of work. And he seemed to be saying that would be way in the future. I think he wants to slow walk that one. So we'll see if Pedro Sanchez can actually push this forward now, make that happen quickly. I think a lot is going to be up to Josep Borrell, the EU's high representative for foreign affairs, who happens to be from Spain, see if he can push this forward, particularly with Israel's neighbors and with the United States.
Dave Keating reporting live from Brussels. Many thanks. That posit put forth by EU leaders, François Heisbourg, that they can keep their eye on the ball in Ukraine and in the Middle East at the same time.
I mean, by EU standards, this was done quickly. I mean, 5 hours is a long time to be speaking at night, but this is not at all unusual in the EU, and given the complexities of the Middle East, it's actually a miracle that it was so quick.
And in the face of what's going on in the Middle East, is the EU leaning more towards polarization, or is the trend towards the moderates winning the day?
I'm not. It depends on what aspect of the issue you're talking about. The fact that it's about pauses or at a stretch a truce rather than a ceasefire, which is quite a different animal, means that, how to put it, the German camp eventually won over, and indeed the trade-off, because there's always a trade-off in the EU, is this international conference, which will greatly please the Spanish. But of course, the problem is that 32 years ago, when the Spanish hosted the big Israeli-Palestinian, the first conference, you had a strong leadership in Palestine. You had Yasser Arafat and the PLO. Today, you have Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, if you prefer, who is on his last legs, both politically and probably biologically. So the conference, unless there is a change of leadership in the Palestinian Authority, is unlikely to yield substantive results. It's desirable in its own right. I mean, I actually think it's a good idea, except you're not going to have the right people around the table. If it's Netanyahu in Israel and Abu Mazen in the Palestinian Authority, wow, don't expect anything to change.
Not everybody follows the Middle East all the time, François Heisbourg. In fact, we heard a series of leaders in the last 3 weeks who've done penitence for not following the Middle East. The question people ask me who aren't news junkies, and they've been asking me this for 3 weeks, is why is this all happening? Why is it, since COVID, first Ukraine, now this?
It's a really good question. Even people who are amongst the best informed and the most powerful, like Jake Sullivan, the head of the American National Security Council, was saying only 3 weeks ago in a sequence which has gone viral in the social media, saying he was so glad that, unlike his predecessors, he didn't have to worry so much about the Middle East, which was more quiet than it had been for the previous 20 years. Well, those were famous, if not last words, but they certainly leave now a very strange taste. Yes, the politics, interstate conflict has become more virulent. You look at the American-Chinese relationship, which was put on, which has become enormously abrasive, notably as a result of the differences of view on the pandemic and on the management of COVID. COVID has left traces. I mean, in strategic terms, you can talk about long COVID. That may be a slight exaggeration, but there's an element of that. There's been a wide loss of civility, and it's, part of it was due to, of course, also the style of leadership of Trump at the time, and indeed of the more mafia-type leadership of Putin. But when all of these things come together in the wake of a wrenching pandemic, you get what you have today, indeed.
All right, that loss of civility, we should definitely be doing a show about that entirely. Many thanks,
thank you,
François Heisbourg, for being with us.